Hi, welcome back to the second half of Session 8, History 3380, World Civilizations. In the first half of this session, we were talking about the origins of European imperialism and how they impacted the world around them in the period roughly from 1500 up to about 1800. And we looked at the way that Europeans insinuated themselves into a variety of local environments, whether it was the Spice Islands or Africa and the Kingdom of the Congo, India, China. But I also pointed out at that time that imperialism hadn't taken on the full-blown aspects, the major characteristics that it would embrace in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. And if we look at the first slide here, what I want to do is briefly summarize what was early imperialism. In other words, a sort of informal, indirect influence on various non-Western parts of the world. One of these aspects is this respect for local cultures. In these earlier centuries, at least up till 1800, you do not see the kind of dismissive attitude that Europeans or Westerners later assumed towards non-Western cultures and civilizations. They are largely dealing with these other societies and cultures either as equals or at least as allies in various local struggles. And we also see local cultural transfers, which the Europeans would describe as sort of going native, meaning that the Europeans often adopted various aspects of local cultures, whether that was in the area of diet, dress, language, even housing. And the Europeans quickly discovered their forms of housing didn't work very well in tropical climates, for example. And local housing, of course, had been designed precisely for those types of climates. And there was a fair degree of intermarriage between Europeans and the residents of these various non-Western cultures, all of which indicated a reasonable acceptance of these cultures and the fact that Europeans did not look down upon the other societies with which they were dealing. And for good reason, because in many cases, such as in India and China, we're dealing with very substantial political units and economies. The economies of China or India individually were as big as the entire economy of Europe, at least until the time of, well, about 1800 or so. So there's some very good material reasons for this relative respect that is shown at this time. Furthermore, for the most part, even though Europeans may intervene or try to manipulate local political events as they did in the Spice Islands, their main purpose is not to impose direct rule, but rather to enhance their trade prospects. The Dutch, for example, are looking to monopolize the spice trade, and they hope to do that in part through these efforts at manipulating the local political process. But the purpose was not to impose direct control. Another example of this is the policy of the East India Company, whether we're talking about the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, both of which operated in the Indian Ocean and in parts of the Pacific, to discourage Christian missionaries from coming to these parts of the globe because they did not want to instigate conflicts between the local cultures and the West. And there was no desire on the part of these large trading units to engage in some kind of missionary activity. Their purpose was not to try to transform the world at this point. Their purpose was simply to try to make a substantial profit by engaging in trade with these regions, which often dealt in very valuable goods in terms of the European perspective. So, yes, there is involvement and growing involvement of the Europeans in various parts of the world, but at the same time, we do not yet see full-blown imperialism. But we're about to see that. We're about to see how the powers of capitalism that was rapidly growing in Europe gave the Europeans a set of technological advantages, at least for a time, in terms of firearms and steamships and other such entities, which they could use to subordinate other civilizations, at least for a relatively brief historical period. The full-blown epic of European imperialism, which begins after 1800, after this sort of period of indirect imperialism. With full-blown imperialism after 1800, there is an outright grab for territory. At the beginning of session 8, I showed you both maps of the world and of Africa to show you how much of the world, but especially Africa, was effectively carved up by the early 20th century among the various European powers. And that's precisely what was happening during the course of the 19th century as the Europeans reached out and seized territories and also imposed their power on hundreds of millions of people in the world, creating colonial regimes that imposed direct political and economic control over a multiplicity of non-Western societies. This is full-blown imperialism. Now, its origins can be traced in part to Africa, to the era of informal empire, which refers pretty much to the kind of thing we were just talking about, and that is that an individual European power might become the dominant economic influence, let us say the Dutch in the Spice Islands, the British in various parts of Western Africa, but they were not, as yet, seeking outright political and economic domination. They were simply the most important economic power in an area. But that began to change dramatically, especially with the end of the slave trade in terms of the European relationship to Africa. Once England decides in the early 19th century that it wants to put an end to the slave trade, this ends what was the central economic relationship between the European powers and the various African cultures and states. It's not that they didn't trade for other goods, but the most important commodity of interchange was human beings ever since the 1500s. As the slave trade is being brought to an end, and it's not as if it ends abruptly in 1807, but rather over the course of the 19th century, it is gradually eliminated or severely reduced in most of Africa. As that is happening, the European states begin looking, and European entrepreneurs begin looking for new opportunities for trade. Some of these they had already explored, but now they wanted to develop more fully. Trade for timber, ivory, rubber, palm oil, minerals, all these different primary products. In other words, agricultural products, mineral products that were available in Africa now became the core of this economic relationship. And we know, again, from what I was talking about in the first half of session 8, that the drive of the Europeans is linked especially to the rise of industrial capitalism in Europe. They are looking for such products as palm oil and minerals as the raw materials to feed their growing industrial plants. And they know that if they can secure those products at low prices, they can secure competitive advantage for their corporations. Whether the English, the Germans, the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, they're all looking for that kind of competitive advantage for industry by securing access to these raw materials. Now, another way to ensure that these goods would be produced at low prices was to use coerced labor to produce those products. In other words, to employ methods other than free wage labor, where you simply go out and offer someone a wage and thereby secure their employment, and they're of course free at any point to leave your employ and take a job somewhere else. Well, coerced labor operates in a different way, and that is you force people to work for you. And we're going to see some of the methods. One simple method is by getting people into debt. Debt peonage, as it's called. It simply means that you borrow money and to pay the debt off. We saw this in Latin America, happens in Africa and elsewhere. To pay the debt off, you have to go work for someone. Various methods, and we will see the use by the state, colonial states, simply forced people to go to work in the mines and the plantations, etc. If not, they'd be thrown into jail, they'd be punished, etc. This, of course, means that the cost of labor is only whatever it costs to force people to go to work. You don't have to pay wages, you don't have to be competitive, and this, of course, can keep down the cost of producing these products. But, of course, if you're going to use coerced labor, you're going to need the power of the state to ensure that people will, in fact, be forced to go to work. So that implies that you're going to have some kind of direct control over these people. It's one thing to simply go and trade for products, but if you want to produce them directly and produce them with coerced labor, you're going to have some kind of direct control over the societies in which they live. It was this kind of set of mechanisms, the end of the slave trade, the development of alternative commodities, the demand that those commodities be produced cheaply for the industrial plants of Europe, that led to this drive to seize territories and establish colonial states, especially in Africa. This process occurred with enormous rapidity during the 19th century. By 1884, by 1884, the European powers decided that they needed to establish some rules of the game, if you will. They hadn't finished seizing Africa, but by now there had been numerous disputes between the European states over which state would control which territory. And it was indeed in many ways a scramble. Explorers, military expeditions being sent out, racing from one point to another and trying to plant the flag, whether for England or France or Germany or Belgium or whomever. So the conference in Berlin in 1884 demonstrated just how enormous a process colonialism had become as the European states sat down to establish the rules that, well, if you seize the headwaters of a river, then you control all of the lands, let us say, east or west of that river system. Rules like this on, who gets what, kind of like setting up the rules for, Monopoly or something. This is how we play the game. One example of this process and its unfolding came with the French in northern Africa with their occupation of Algeria in 1842. And that began a process in which the French established an enormous holding of territories in northern Africa, including not only Algeria, but places like Morocco, Sudan, sub-Saharan Africa, were taken over by the French in rapid order, beginning with this occupation in 1842. The British were busy in their own right on the west coast of Africa, places like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, and in the east, Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, and what were known as the Rhodesias. We'll talk a little bit more about their origin in a moment. It was that line of colonies from Egypt through Kenya, through the Rhodesias, and eventually all the way to South Africa that I was showing you on the map in the first half of the session as the British established this column, if you will, of states down the eastern side of Africa. And all of this taking place in a relatively few decades. It would be late in the 19th century before South Africa became a formal colony of the British, but nevertheless, they are seizing massive amounts of territory in a space of merely a few decades. Now, the French and the British had different methods of rule when they imposed their control over the African colonies and over colonies in other parts of the world, such as in Asia. The British opted for a system that they had employed to some degree all the way back to the time of their North American colonies. And that was a system of indirect rule, as it might be termed. I called that for this reason, that the British would appoint, of course, a royal governor to oversee whether it was Kenya, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast. But beyond that, the people who would govern in conjunction with the governor would be drawn in part from the local resident colonial population. In other words, British residents would be drawn into what were called governor's councils to advise the governor and to work, as time went on, essentially as a mini legislature. So what we have is, yes, a royal governor who reports back to London, but we also have considerable influence by the local British colonists through the Governor's Council. And that gives at least a larger say to them in how each state is managed. The French, on the other hand, in part because it was only infrequently that there were large numbers of French residents in many of their colonies, but also by preference, the French opted for a direct rule system. In other words, there is a governor, and there really is no secondary authority other than the governor, who reports again directly back to Paris, but he does not expect to have to turn to the local colonial population in order to make decisions such as changing taxes or policies about how funds might be expended in the colony. All of that is done directly by the governor. So there is a much more direct kind of rule, more authoritarian if you want to describe it that way, although neither system was exactly democratic, since at the most the British included only their own colonists in any type of governance. The French also had a somewhat different perspective, as we'll see, on the process of governance than did the British. The French put a lot of emphasis on the importance of French culture and the idea of cultural assimilation. The French believed, of course they had an enormous pride in their own culture, saw themselves as the preeminent culture of the West, and they believed that indeed they could transform the populations of their colonies by means of education, by means of the absorption of their culture, and that those members of African colonies, the indigenous population, that portion of the population that indeed accepted French education and had an opportunity to receive a French education, that they became effectively co-citizens in the French imperial system. This was a matter of cultural citizenship, if you want. So the French put considerable store in this idea. Now this does not mean, as the French look at their colonies, that they're going out and engaging in mass popular education, because none of the colonial powers did that. What they were interested in doing was educating a very small elite, and we'll see the justification for this in a couple of minutes when we talk about the British. But each of these European states had the same idea that at most they were going to educate a small part of the total population for practical purposes of their own. And that's the group the French had in mind. They did not expect that the entire population of all their colonial possessions were going to become essentially French as a result of cultural assimilation. It just wasn't going to happen. At the same time, the French built a typical model of economic exploitation of their colonies, one that again was repeated time and again by the British, the Germans, and others, and that was to focus on agricultural and mineral exploitation, to develop agricultural products, specifically ones that could be exported because of their commercial value, and the same with mining products. And in the case of the French, for example, the French textile industry came to rely on cotton grown in Africa to fuel its spinning machines and its weaving machines to produce the basic products of the French textile industry. The British did somewhat the same thing, although they relied on multiple sources. One of them was Egyptian cotton for the British textile industry. So the French pattern is classic in this regard, that education was going to be limited to a very small group, and the whole purpose of the economic system was to exploit the commercial opportunities in agriculture and mining. And the purpose of exploiting them was not to benefit the larger population, but simply to provide cheap resources to be supplied back to the mother country and its economy. This is why, even though, as we look at various African colonies, and for that matter, European colonies elsewhere in the world, we see enormous wealth being generated, but at the same time we see societies that remain inherently impoverished, because the purpose was not to spread the wealth. This was not the idea, as it is in a self-governing state, that you promote economic development so it will benefit the whole population, perhaps to varying degrees, but nevertheless benefit the entire population. There was no effort to build viable state and economic systems here. It was simply the idea of exporting the wealth of these societies and shipping it back to Europe. On the British side, one man who came to epitomize British imperialism and imperial thinking in general by Europeans in the 19th century was a man named Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was a fantastically ambitious individual, and he typified what we'll be talking about in a few minutes, and that was an imperial mindset. He believed that the rest of the world was there simply for Europeans to exploit. As he once said, if I could, I would annex the stars. In other words, it wasn't enough just to seize vast territories in Africa or in other parts of the world. He'd reach out to the universe if he could and subordinate those regions. And that was built on a belief that Europeans were indeed inherently superior, and that other groups, other cultures, and civilizations, which Europeans would refer to as other races at this time, that they were inherently inferior, and they're really to serve the interests of the Europeans, serve the interests of Westerners, and that was their basic function. So of course, there was nothing wrong with, there was nothing ethically wrong with seizing vast territories and imposing your will on millions of people. Rhodes made an enormous fortune in diamond mining, and he helped found the De Beers Company, and the De Beers Company is, of course, a massive diamond monopoly. At one time, it controlled 90% of the diamond trade of the world. Now it only controls about 60% of it. But still, it's because of De Beers and other companies like it that diamonds are expensive. If it weren't for De Beers, which buys up billions of dollars of diamonds every year and holds them off the market, the price for diamonds would plummet astronomically. You know, that diamond ring you just paid $3,000 for would be worth about $30 because they keep diamonds off the market and thus keep the prices up. This really started with Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was also responsible for helping to seize the territories in southern Africa that became known as the Rhodesias, northern and southern Rhodesia. Were they named after Cecil Rhodes, of course. He also once said that he dreamed early in his career of a British Empire that would stretch from Cairo to Cape Town. In other words, from the northern shores of Africa all the way to its southern tip. And he, in effect, helped the British create just such an empire, this vast territory. And again, the British, like the French, turned towards coercive labor as a way of manning plantations and manning the mines that filled the ships with agricultural and mineral products sailing back to Britain. One of the basic ways the British did this was through what was called the head tax. A head tax was a tax imposed on people not because they had income, not because they were citizens of a state and everyone must pay this tax, not because they had purchased something because it was a sales tax. Head tax was imposed because you were African. And that's why you pay the head tax, because you're African. Now, there are two purposes for the tax. One is, yes, it helps generate revenues to support the colonial governments. But there's a far more important purpose. The head tax had to be paid in cash, in coin of the realm. You had to have money to pay the head tax. You couldn't pay it with a chicken or a goat, whatever. You had to have cash. This was essentially a non-existent commodity in African societies. Why would they have British coins? No reason to, until the British took over. The beauty of this is that in order to earn the money needed to pay the head tax, you had to go to work for the British, because the British could pay you in the currency that you needed to pay the head tax. So why do you go to work in a plantation or a mine? Well, there are multiple possibilities, but one compelling reason why many people had to go to work was that they had to pay the head tax. You might well be a peasant farmer doing reasonably well, raising a few crops, self-sufficient. But if you had to pay the head tax, you didn't have any access to cash. So you or your son or one of your children was going to have to go work for the British in order to earn the money to pay the head tax, even though you're otherwise self-sufficient. So it was a way of pulling Africans off the land, pulling them away from their own self-sufficient activities, and bringing them into the larger export economies that the British were creating by taxing them, which forced them then to go to work in a British enterprise in order to earn the tax money. Another method that was used was a little more crude and was commonly used by European colonial powers, and that was simply labor gangs. That the state would simply order a certain number of males, usually, to be taken from certain identified territories and sent off to work, particularly in the mines, or to build public works projects, etc. So it was simply, you were ordered to do it. Very basic coerced labor. Sometimes one colonial state would actually secure labor for another. For example, colonies surrounding South Africa, which had a number of very large mining enterprises, would force workers to be marched off to go work in South Africa, even though it wasn't even the colony that they were living in, but there was a labor need there, and so they were simply ordered to do so. So aside from the sort of indirect coercion of the head tax, there is the outright coercion of the governor or the local provincial official simply ordering people to go to work for certain British enterprises or to carry out certain public works for the government. Now, with one substantial exception, the colonies in Africa were created by the European states themselves and controlled by them, however directly or indirectly British versus French models. One exception was the colony created by King Leopold II of Belgium. What Leopold did was to create a personal colony to acquire territories directly, and for many years to run that colony outside of the institutions of the Belgian state. This was how the Belgian Congo was created. This enterprise had its beginnings with a correspondent named Henry Stanley. He was working for an American newspaper and took on the story of Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. David Livingstone was a Christian medical missionary who had gone into Central Africa to carry out missionary activities. And in his case, of course, as a medical missionary, he would try to bring the benefits of Western medicine while at the same time preaching a Christian message. After several years in which there was no contact with Livingstone, the question arose whether this great man in the eyes of the Europeans had in fact expired. Stanley got the idea to go to Africa and search for him. And this became one of the great stories of the mid-19th century as Stanley treks into Africa and finally in a clearing sees this gentle old man and says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," and of course the story is flashed across the world, that Dr. Livingstone has been found. What's more important to us is that Henry Stanley had established himself as an enterprising individual with considerable experience of exploring in Africa. He turned that into work as an agent for King Leopold of Belgium and began acquiring territories in Central Africa in Leopold's name. These territories were gathered together as a single entity that was originally called the Congo Free State, which had very little that was free about it. Now, with other European colonies, there were, of course, state-assigned governors who went in and administered these various colonies and determined within national government policy in Europe how their economy should function, how the colony would be administered. But the Congo Free State lacked that because it wasn't a state colony. It was a personal property of Leopold II. What Leopold did to exploit his colony was to grant concessions to various private trading companies to go in and exploit the multiple resources that lay within his possessions. Things like elephant ivory, rubber, minerals such as copper, etc. This allowed him at low cost to economically exploit these rich territories. But it also meant there was really no restraint on these companies. There was no colonial governor. There was no colonial army answering to a state system back in Europe to at least limit the exploitation of the population. As a result, the Congo Free State became perhaps the worst example of European abuse in Africa. It was the stories of gross abuse by the trading companies that helped inspire Joseph Conrad's novel, The Heart of Darkness. And it's clear that Conrad, and everyone was aware of it when he wrote the story, that he was really using the Congo Free State as his model for this African colony, where the Europeans had sunk to this incredibly low level as they repeatedly abused the Africans, who they deemed to be subhuman, while they themselves sank to the lowest possible level of existence. And it was this compelling story which helped attract renewed attention in Europe to conditions in the Congo Free State. Now, with all of the exploitation and abuse, it is also true that Europeans did see themselves on this mission of reform. To some extent, this is inspired by basic ideas that the Europeans have about their own superiority and about the fact that it is indeed the white man's burden, as they would term it, to go and see to the betterment of inferior races. But it was also driven by Christian principles, a belief that Christianity does have a missionary purpose in the world, to go teach all nations, to share Christianity with all cultures. And at this time in the 19th century, that missionary impulse was often given expression through what was called the social gospel. The idea that it was the responsibility of Christians not just to go and convert people to Christianity, but to share with them what were considered the benefits and the advances of Western culture. This meant, of course, the establishment of medical clinics such as Dr. Livingston, the building of schools to teach children rudimentary language skills, writing skills, mathematical skills, and at the same time have the practical purpose of drawing people to Christianity by demonstrating the superior accomplishments of Christian culture through these clinics and these schools. So there is at least an element in all of this of idealism, at least among Christian missionaries who see this as their higher purpose in life, to convert people to their own religion and to demonstrate and share with them what they see as the benefits of Western culture. At the same time, the colonial governors were not the least bit hesitant to encourage such missionary activity and to, in fact, establish schools themselves, even in the absence of Christian missionaries, because all of this acculturation was seen as an important mechanism of social control. If you can convince a significant educated element in the population that in fact Western culture is superior and that there is benefit in the presence of the Europeans, even if they have imposed themselves on you contrary to your own will, that you can convince at least a small elite that it is in their interests of their larger society, to cooperate with the Europeans. So this was an ulterior motive that the European states had, not only in encouraging Christian missionaries, but in general in providing at least limited degrees of education and medical assistance. The idea that they would, again, engage in mass education was totally beyond the realm of thought of colonial policymakers. What they wanted to do was educate a small minority, which hopefully would align itself with the European ruling group. Now, there was African resistance to the imposition of European control, and it took various forms. Sometimes flight, simply fleeing the colonial powers as they imposed themselves on various parts of Africa, trying to flee into the rainforests, into the mountains, simply escape European rule. There was also subtle forms of resistance in terms of labor, people resisting hard work in the mines and in the plantations, trying to do as little as they possibly could, because of course they saw themselves quite rightly as being exploited. And there were cases of outright resistance, such as at the Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria. I talked about Sokoto a little bit last time in terms of the emerging British presence in Nigeria. And this Islamic state that dominated northwestern Nigeria for most of the 19th century was finally sacked by the British in 1903. A series of military expeditions that finally overran the Sokoto Caliphate and brought its rule to an end. So there were examples of armed resistance and uprisings in Africa. But time and again, the British superiority in weapons, as much as Africans might have access to some weaponry from the West, the Western states, of course, could bring in steamboats, machine guns, artillery pieces that overwhelmed the weaponry that local resistors might have. So there was indeed considerable African resistance in various forms, but ultimately it was the military might of the Europeans that could ensure their rule. So in Africa, European colonialism takes the form of direct political control or rule. This meant disestablishing the local political elites, simply removing the top figures in African political systems and imposing European control. Along with that came the creation of export economies, the development of large mining enterprises, agricultural plantations, the building of railroads and ports to link those mines and those plantations to the coast and ensure the shipment of these products back to Europe in order to feed the growing industrial economies of the European powers. These enterprises, whether they were agricultural or mining, required massive investments of labor, and this was achieved through coercion. Whether it was labor gangs or various types of indebtedness that forced Africans to work, such as the head tax. And of course, coercion was also necessary because in most cases, since Africans were already sustaining themselves as small farmers or as herders of animals, you had to force these people out of those traditional enterprises and into these massive commercial enterprises that were in the interests of the Europeans to run. Ultimately, European control depended on two factors. One was acculturation, trying to at least bring a small portion of the population an exposure to European culture through language, through medical facilities, through schooling, in order to win them over to the idea that indeed the European presence would have a positive impact on their own societies. And, as we will see in the case of India, to also train these people to serve in the lower echelons of the colonial bureaucracy. This was true in India, it was also true in Africa. The European states realized that it was an enormously expensive enterprise to send thousands and thousands of Europeans to Africa and to other parts of the world to serve as colonial bureaucrats. So their numbers could be diminished if you educated a certain small portion of the local population and distributed to them minor jobs as clerks, etc. In the colonial bureaucracy, you reduce your costs. Well, at the same time, by educating them and exposing them to what you consider to be the wonders of Western culture, you hope to win them over and make them your allies in the rule of these colonial states. At the same time, in the cases of outright resistance and rebellion, the Europeans could count upon their technological superiority, their military superiority, to suppress such rebellions and ensure their continued rule even when acculturation didn't work with total effectiveness. Now, the single most important colony in the single most important European colonial system was the British colony of India. It was often referred to as the jewel in the British imperial crown. That was because of India's enormous size and because of the enormous economic opportunities generated for the British in India. India was both a source of raw materials, such as cotton, jute, other agricultural products, and an enormous market, as it turned out, for British textiles. So here you got both halves of the imperial economic enterprise. In other words, you both got access to cheap raw materials to feed your industries, and you also got an enormous market to sell those goods in when your own markets at home couldn't absorb all of the product produced by your industries. India ideally fit both of those requirements. Now, we saw the beginnings of direct British involvement with the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when the British East India Company intervenes in the battle between Zamindars and Mansabdars, siding with the Zamindars, the Hindu princes. And out of that comes control imposed by the British East India Company on the northeastern portions of the Indian subcontinent, known as Bengal. This was the beginning of the true imperial enterprise for the British in India. But again, at this time at least, it's not a formal government colony. This is a region controlled by the British East India Company. And gradually, out of this initial breakthrough after the Battle of Plassey, the British East India Company will continue to extend its control by enveloping the rest of the subcontinent piecemeal. In other words, there'd be confrontations with this prince or that prince. The British would attack or negotiate the subordination of this group or that group. Much like the Mughals had done centuries earlier, it's a gradual encroachment over the entire subcontinent. What was striking about what the British East India Company could do was it was the most pervasive, centralized control that had ever been imposed on the Indian subcontinent, for the simple reason that the British had the technologies to make it work. They had not only the power of their steamships, but increasingly in the 19th century, they were able to lay tens of thousands of miles of railroad track so that they could move troops rapidly to any part of the subcontinent in order to suppress resistance. Now, in 1786, the position of the British East India Company is somewhat reduced when the Act of 1786 establishes that the company in India is acting as a subordinate of the British Crown. In other words, yes, you're a company, and technically you have control over a substantial part of Indian territory, but now you must act with the oversight of the British government. It does not mean that the company had lost its power, but now it had to report directly to and be supervised by the British bureaucracy. The company was still running the territories in India, but now had to report directly to the British government. So this is a step in the direction towards India becoming an outright British state colony. And this takes place in 1786, 30 years after the Battle of Plassey. Now, as this process unfolds, as India becomes enveloped by British control, and as gradually the British state imposes more direct control itself, first through the company, and then eventually, as we'll see, bypassing the company in essence, important changes are going to take place in India. One of the most important was the role of the zamindars, or the Hindu princes. Traditionally, in India, there had not been what we would view as a class of large landowners. That's not to say that members of the elite didn't have substantial land holdings, but the central focus of the zamindars was their position as the leading figures in the caste system, and their right to collect tribute on their own behalf, on behalf of the Mughal Empire, to collect tribute from the local population. But the British system that we've seen undergo its own transformation in the 17th century, of large landowners with thousands perhaps of, or at least hundreds of yeomen, peasants working the land owned by the owner of the manor, the sort of typical European pattern, that had not emerged in India. But now the British work to make it emerge. They establish laws that help create a large landowning class out of the zamindars. They are going to be more than just the leading figures in the caste. They are going to have large agricultural properties. Why? Well, there were two reasons. One is because the British believed that theirs was the ideal model. And this is typical of imperial thinking, that they look at their own society and say, well, this has worked wonderfully for us. I mean, we have the parliament, we have control over the crown, we have a prosperous economy, and of course all this is rooted in the genius of the British elite. And who are the British elite? They're a large landowning class. So, if we want stability in India, if we want the same kind of dynamism that we see in our own society, what we need to do first is create a large landowning class like our own. So part of this is the idea that, well, we'll replicate our own society, at least in terms of the elite, in India, at least in terms of there being a large landowning elite. The second motivation is that they want to create a local class that will be devoted to commercial agriculture, to the idea of producing large amounts of products for export. Peasants don't do that very well. Peasants are focused on the idea of producing a diverse range of products, usually food products that they can consume, so that if any one product, any one crop fails in a given year, then the others will still be there to sustain them. So, just like stock investors of today are told to diversify, peasants thousands of years ago learned the same basic principle. You don't want to just grow one crop, because if that crop is sensitive, let us say, to drought, and you have a drought this year, you lose the whole crop, you starve. But if you are producing 3 or 4 crops, several of which might be subject to drought, but several others which can do quite well in dry weather, then you'll survive. That doesn't make for good commercial agriculture, because you're not producing large amounts of agricultural product that you can export. you're producing products that you're going to consume yourself. So the British, in creating this large landowning class, wanted to create a group of landowners who would promote commercial agriculture, and of course for the purpose of exporting those goods back to England. And indeed, through this system, the zamindars, the great landowners, began producing cotton, jute, coffee, and other agricultural products that could be exported to England. So in this very complex way, the British create in India, again, the ideal colony in terms of huge export products being produced by a domestic elite. Now, there's then the other half of the ideal colony, and that has to do with the consumption of products being produced by British industry. And the key to this was British textiles. The textile industry was the industry which had really built the Industrial Revolution in England. Starting with the putting out system that we talked about, the spinning of wool fiber into thread, and then converting that thread into textiles. This had been really the root industry for England. But by the 19th century, there were increasingly difficult times for the textile industry because the industry's productive capacity was outstripping domestic consumption. So if you could find a huge new market with tens of millions of people in it, there was an opportunity to once again spur expansion in this critical British industry. Now, of course, the Indians had their own textile industry, much of it home developed, sort of craft industries, individuals weaving cloth at home or in small areas that they set aside for this purpose. So actually, textile consumption was being met in India by local production, although it was on hand looms, not on through machinery. What the British did was to allow the massive import of British textiles into India without any kind of tariff, any kind of tax being imposed on the import of those goods. What this meant was that the machine-produced textiles from Britain could sell for much lower prices than could the handmade products in India. So this was going to wipe out a considerable portion of the domestic industry of India, and in the process, of course, create a huge new market for the British textile industry. So in this way, with these two mechanisms of the zamindars as great landowners and then the massive import of cheap textiles, India became the ideal colony for the British, supplying cheap raw materials and a vast new market for British textiles. Now, along the way, the British worked assiduously to integrate this massive holding into a single colonial state. They built tens of thousands of miles of railroads, as I said before, connecting the distant parts of the Indian subcontinent in a way they had never been connected before, through the telegraph, allowing almost instantaneous communication over thousands of miles. Again, something that simply had never happened before. Basically, Western technologies conquering the challenges of an environment that had prevented the long-term consolidation of political rule in the Indian subcontinent for thousands of years. They also brought newspapers for their own purposes originally, to provide newspapers for their own colonial population, their own colonists. But increasingly, introducing the printing press meant that Indians themselves began producing their own newspapers. And this set of events has, as we will see down the road, some unintended consequences. The main purposes the British have, of course, is to tie this vast territory with all its topographical challenges together, to take the distinct parts of India and try to weld them into a single whole. Railroads can not only move people from one part of India to another, allowing them to communicate more effectively face to face, but you can also move troops to suppress rebellion. Telegraph assists that same process. You can almost instantaneously learn about a rebellion somewhere and send your forces off. The newspapers to help communicate the basic ideas of the British colonial administrators to the Indian population. But in the end, what the British succeeded in doing in many ways is giving the residents of the Indian subcontinent a better sense of themselves. That they could indeed meet face to face in ways that had been virtually impossible in prior centuries. That they could indeed communicate with each other in a rapid fashion. That they could indeed develop a sense of common identity through newspapers, something that newspapers do in societies, and we're doing it throughout the world in the 19th and through much of the 20th century. I mean, if you're living, let us say, in the United States in the 19th century or the early 20th century, how do you know what America is like? You know, what the country as a whole is like. You don't travel across, North America from coast to coast. And you read about things in the newspapers. You read about what other Americans are like. That's what newspapers do. They help create a sense of community over vast distances, and that's what the British newspapers did, or the Indian produced newspapers. Intended? No. But in the end, important consequences would flow from these efforts of the British to use their technologies to extend their control, maintain their control. In the end, as we will see, it will help undermine it. Now, just as in Africa, there are serious challenges to European rule in India. In 1857, there was the Great Sepoy Rebellion. Now, the British explanation of this, and if you read textbooks written maybe 30 or 40 years ago, they'll say, well, the Sepoys were essentially mercenary troops that were hired to work in the British colonial army, because again, colonial armies consisted mostly of locals who were recruited or paid simply to fight in these armies with a small officer corps, an NCO corps, perhaps, made up of Europeans. And supposedly the rebellion breaks out either because Hindu or Muslim troops are offended over issues involving the use of pig fat or cow fat to seal the cartridges that they use in their rifles. This is all, The significance of this is that, okay, maybe an incident like that triggered, a violent moment. But the main reasons for the Sepoy Mutiny and for the massive rebellions that broke out, because this was not simply a mutiny by some troops, was a rebellion against British rule, and specifically the rule of the British East India Company. The loss of political power for local rulers that was increasingly evident. Maybe the British East India Company sided with the zamindars at the Battle of Plassey, but over the following 100 years, what they were doing was subordinating the zamindars to their control. The land policies, which had created these large landed estates and which had cost so many people in the countryside their land holdings and reduced so many of them to workers on these large estates, that fueled rebellion. The destruction of the local textile industry by the massive import of cheap British textiles, that was a cause for rebellion. And the introduction of Christian missionaries and their efforts to convert the local Hindu and Islamic populations further fueled rebellion. So the Sepoy Rebellion was not simply some type of military mutiny. It was, in fact, a vast uprising against British rule, and specifically the rule of the British East India Company. And when the British finally managed to subdue it, the British government holds the East India Company responsible. The Sepoy Rebellion really marks the end of control by the British East India Company. From this moment forward, after 1857, what you have is a full-blown European state colony in India. The government in London is now in direct control. What you are dealing with is not the supervision of the British East India Company employees, but rather government bureaucrats who now run India as a formal state colony. Now, another important aspect of what happens with the British in India is the changing mentality of the British towards the population. Again, through several centuries of encounter, the British had had enormous respect for Indian society. Its architectural achievements, the sheer size of its economic system, the size of the Mughal Empire, its intellectual achievements. And for a time, the British saw themselves essentially as partners, in a way, in furthering the development of these societies by providing exposure to Western culture. But increasingly, British mentality changed, especially by the middle of the 19th century. And this can be seen in what's known as Thomas Macaulay's Minute on Education. Macaulay was a well-known intellectual in England. He was serving in the British cabinet. And he presented a report on education in India. It becomes part of the minutes of the cabinet meeting. That's why it's called Macaulay's Minute. Essentially, what Macaulay said was that, look, we're not on some kind of joint enterprise here. We're here to control these people because they aren't capable of effective self-rule. And if we're going to engage in education, what we're going to do is educate a small part of the population. We're going to educate those people, so as Macaulay put it, that while their skin may remain dark, their minds will be white, so that they will be the perfect intermediaries between British rulers and the larger population. They will be members of an indigenous elite trained in Western culture and Western ways of thought, and supposedly convinced of the efficacy of continued British rule. Clearly, this is a moment in which the British have firmly set themselves on a course of domination, and where they clearly see the people of the Indian subcontinent as their inferiors and people who must be reined in and controlled by the British. A larger mentality that develops is of this idea of the British as these vigorous, powerful males who are on this energetic enterprise to transform the world. The term mad dogs and Englishmen out in the noonday sun was actually meant as complimentary to the British. It was an Englishman who made it up. The idea that, look, only the English, with their boundless energy and their determination, could go out and work like dogs every day to transform India, which is not exactly what they were doing, because most of the work is being done by the Indians. But this was the British image of themselves, that we're out there, you know, we're vigorous, we've got our pith helmets on, and we're transforming the society. And the reason we have to do this is because the local population is seen as effeminate. And the significance of that is, in Western culture at this time, and well into the 20th century, women are seen as fundamentally irrational. You know, women need the supervision of males. So to envision Indians as effeminate was to suggest that, well, these people are fundamentally, irrational. They are like children, and women were treated as children as well. So this is why we need to be here, to take care of them. This is the white man's burden. Just as white males are responsible for taking care of their wives, so too they must take care of these massive populations in non-Western societies who, like Western women, are not really capable of clear, rational, objective thought, and certainly not capable of taking care of their own affairs. Here, we see the full-blown development of the European imperial mentality. Finally, China. Now, when we last visited China, we were talking about the Opium War. The British, as with other European powers, had been limited in their trade with China by the Chinese imperial state to trading in one port for a brief period each year. The British, at the same time, suffered from a severe trade imbalance as the Chinese economy absorbed tons of British silver, as the British purchased tons of Chinese tea and porcelain and other such products, silks. To balance that trade off, the British had tried to expand their sale of opium in China. That had led to conflict with the Chinese in 1839, leading to the Opium War. China's loss in that war, if you can call it that, forced it to open up a series of ports called the treaty ports. Those ports operated under what was known as extraterritoriality, the principle of extraterritoriality. That meant that in the major urban centers of China, stretched along its coast, there were essentially two governments. One would be the Chinese municipal government, and one would be European. Depending on the port, could be the British, French, Germans, Russians. So while China was not formally colonized, it suffered an enormous loss of sovereignty because its most important cities, the key to its growing economy, was now at least partially in the hands of Europeans. One group that benefited from this was the Chinese merchant class. Chinese merchants had long been looked down upon as second class in their social standing. But now, those merchants engaged in international trade were becoming extraordinarily prosperous. They were even beginning to invest in the early development of industry in China, manufacturing. That would lead them to challenge the existing elite, the scholarly gentry, the trained bureaucrats, the great landowners who had so long dominated China. At the same time, a growing population, growing urban population, increasing trade internationally, led to growing commercialization of agriculture, sometimes by large landowners, sometimes by well-to-do peasants. The end result, no matter what the origin of this process, who instigated it, was in growing disparities between rich and poor. Commercialization meant that peasants either lost land to large estates, or that some peasants became much more well off than others because some peasants took the risk of investing in a single product, let's say silk, succeeded at it, while others tried and failed or did not engage in commercial enterprises. And we have a growing disparity between rich and poor. So we have both loss of land creating that disparity, but also those who engage in commercial enterprise and succeed, and those who fail. We have a massive population of over 400 million people that is becoming increasingly difficult to feed because China's technology has fallen behind. China still largely relies on fertilizer and acquiring additional land in order to expand agricultural production. It does not have the kinds of machinery that were being used in the West. All of these factors, growing disparities between rich and poor, conflicts between the merchants, and the traditional elite and this massive demographic problem helped stir social unrest. One of the great uprisings of all time in China occurred between 1851 and 1864, the Great Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion has interesting origins because its leader, Wang Juquan, was on the one hand a candidate at one time to become a member of the scholarly gentry. He had studied the Chinese classics. He was training to be a Chinese bureaucrat. But like many, he failed the examinations and was denied a position in the bureaucracy. On the other hand, he was also, as a child of his times, exposed to Christian missionaries, Western Christian missionaries who would come to China. He took his frustrations along with the message of Christianity to form his own religious movement, envisioning himself as the brother of Jesus Christ and assuring his followers that he would create a heavenly kingdom of great peace, an egalitarian society. He essentially took Confucius and his philosophy and turned it on its head and said, now it will not be the great and powerful, but the humblest of the Chinese people who will rule society. He launched a massive uprising in southern China that eventually led to the deaths of some 20 million people. Many of them not directly through warfare, but through starvation, famine, disease. The increasingly weakened imperial system was only able to fend off the rebellion by empowering local landowners to develop military units to defeat the rebels. This led to the rise of increasingly powerful regional leaders, the great warlords of China, and it meant even further disintegration in the power of the central government in China. As all of this is happening and China is being torn apart internally by social rebellion, the European states, Russia and Mongolia and Manchuria, France and southern China, are expanding their influence, creating spheres of influence, moving beyond just the treaty ports to impose their control, albeit indirectly, these are not formal colonies, but impose their control nonetheless on vast regions of the Chinese imperial territory. China is being subordinated by its own internal crises, by the increasing imposition of European power from the outside, by the undermining of traditional social structures, both through commercialization of agriculture, the rise of increasingly empowered merchant class. All of these factors are creating turmoil in China and making it possible for the Europeans to expand their control. Again, China never becomes a formal colony, but it suffers many of the same subordinations as India and much of Africa in this complex process in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And we will see that ultimately these processes lay the groundwork for China's communist revolution in the middle of the 20th century. Meanwhile, going back to this period of high imperialism, if we want to call it that, looking at its causes, we see in Europe these large competing industrial economies looking for markets for their goods and looking for cheap inputs, raw materials. This becomes a major drive to secure these products and secure them by seizing territories, most notably in Africa and India. The process is facilitated by disruptions in the periphery, disintegration in China, the effects of the slave trade upon Africa. Europeans feel justified in their territorial expansion by their racist beliefs, their belief that they represent the superior race in humanity, and that they are empowered by that to subordinate all other races. There is an idealistic element to this, the missionary impulse of Christianity, the belief that it is the responsibility of Christians to spread the word of Christianity, and the belief that along the way they will also be bringing the benefits of Western culture to these other, of course, inferior cultures. The effects of this high age of imperialism are outright political domination of much of the world by Europe, the development of coerced labor systems to produce the agricultural and mining goods the Europeans are looking for, the development of export economies geared to feeding the needs of the Europeans, and economies where industrialization, such as in India, is discouraged. And finally, we also see the development of imperial mentalities, that sense, for example, that the British had in India, of being these powerful, rational, aggressive males who were destined to dominate the effeminate, irrational populations of the rest of the world. Thank you.